This video is brought to you by Audible. For the month of July, Amazon Prime members can start an Audible membership and save 66% on the first 3 months. That means $4.95 a month for the first 3 months, and then it's $14.95 a month. All you have to do is go to audible.com/companyman or text companyman to 500-500. The link's in the description. AT&T, you could say they're pretty big. It's a Fortune 500 company. The Fortune 500 ranks the largest 500 US companies by revenue, so obviously anyone on it is huge. Well, AT&T is number 9 with, get this, $170 billion in revenue. When I categorize the list by most profitable companies, coincidentally, they're still number 9 with almost $20 billion. They're one of the 3 companies that made both of those top 10 lists. It's hard to get much bigger than that, but they used to be much bigger than that. In the early 1980s, they were the biggest company in the world. In 1981, they had profits of $6.9 billion, which was the highest ever recorded at that time. But just 3 years later, they were broken up. It depends on how you measure it, but I would say to about a third, maybe a fourth of their size. Their assets were reduced from $155 billion to $34 billion. Their income dropped from $7.1 billion to $2.1 billion. They used to employ over 1 million people, and now it was down to 385,000. But now, here they are again, back near the top. Sort of. That'll make sense later, but what I want to talk about today is the rise and fall and rise again of AT&T. I actually covered most of the rise part in a previous video, just last week actually, but here's a summary. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell received a patent for the invention of the telephone, which gave him exclusive rights to the telephone industry. He, his assistant, and a couple of close investors were able to utilize that advantage and create a business that was so massive by the time that patent expired in 1894, they were too big to compete with. In the early 1900s, the government had concerns of it being a monopoly, so they struck an agreement with them called the Kingsbury Commitment that set a few limitations but ended up resulting in what's commonly referred to as a government-approved monopoly over the telephone industry. That's where that video left off, so continuing from there. In 1921, there was the Willis-Graham Act, which didn't really change anything. It pretty much further protected AT&T's dominance by exempting telephones from the Sherman Antitrust Act. At that point, there were 14 million phones in the United States, of which 9 million were controlled by AT&T. That's 64%. By the late 1930s, it was really starting to get out of control. That 64% was up to 83%. They also controlled 98% of long-distance lines, plus a company that they own called Western Electric manufactured 90% of all telephone equipment. This made the FCC say, hold on, we're going to have to take a closer look here because it sure seems like there's some violations. Then, the ultimate distraction occurred when the US became involved in World War II. Everyone shifted their attention and the investigation was put on hold. A few years after the war, the Department of Justice picked up where the FCC left off. Their biggest issue was Western Electric. They saw it as a vertical monopoly. AT&T was operating every part of the telephone business from start to finish, and that's a concern. Everything sort of came to a head in 1956 when AT&T made an agreement that I'm sure was intended to get everyone off their back. The agreement said that they would limit the equipment they used that was produced by Western Electric, buy some stuff from other manufacturers. I don't know how much that really helped with anything. The bigger part of it was they agreed to stick to the telephone industry and not expand into other areas. Computers were the big thing that they were looking into and felt they could utilize a lot of their existing resources to be successful in. Well, this agreement prevented it. It essentially said that you can keep Western Electric, continue functioning as a monopoly in the telephone industry, just leave everything else alone. And it worked. For the next 18 years, they continued dominating the telephone industry, mostly unbothered. In 1974, one of their competitors, MCI, started things up again when they filed an antitrust lawsuit against them, and the Department of Justice came in with their own lawsuit soon after. In 1981, it finally went to trial, and in 1982, they made another agreement, a much more impactful one this time. They agreed to break up and get rid of their local telephone businesses, but they'd now be able to compete in other areas, like computers. It was really the exact opposite of their last agreement. So now, they took all of their local operating companies, which was 22, and reconfigured them into 7 regional Bell operating companies, commonly referred to as Baby Bells. The AT&T stockholders would receive 1 share share in each of the regional companies for every 10 shares of AT&T stock that they already owned. These were the 7 new companies. You have Ameritech, Bell Atlantic, Bell South, NYNEX, Pacific Telesis, Southwestern Bell, and US West. And then here's the map of the region each one of them covered, so if you lived in one of those areas at the time, I'm sure you would recognize the name from your telephone bill. AT&T now existed in 2 parts. They still had their long-distance business, labeled AT&T Communications, and they were still involved in manufacturing and research, labeled AT&T Technologies. That part included an altered, broken-up version of what was Western Electric and the famous Bell Labs. This version of the company didn't do the best. They lost a lot of money trying to get into personal computers, they were losing their share in the long distance market, so they got involved in a few other things. In the early 1990s, they started a credit card called Universal Card, they bought a computer and technology business called NCR for over $7 billion. They were involved in a lot here. They became kind of split and unfocused, so in 1995, they split up again, this time into 3 different parts. I won't get into the specifics of this one, because 5 years after that, they split again. By the year 2000 split, a lot of other stuff was gone. NCR was separated in the 1995 split and they sold the credit card to Citibank. This 2000 split resulted in 4 separate companies with names that are fairly self-explanatory. AT&T Consumer, AT&T Business, AT&T Broadband, and AT&T Wireless. Things get tricky here. First off, 1 year later, AT&T Broadband was bought by Comcast, and 3 years after that, in 2004, AT&T Wireless was bought by Singular Wireless. Do you remember Singular with that orange guy? Alright, now that those are out of the way, let me get into it. Remember these 7 regional Bell operating companies? Baby Bells? Well, they were morphing together again. In 1997, NYNEX acquired Bell Atlantic. Then in 2000, they acquired another independent phone company unrelated to any of this called GTE. Upon that acquisition, they changed their name to Verizon. So that's where Verizon comes from. Southwestern Bell is the other notable one. In 1995, they changed their name to SBC Communications. Then in 1997, they acquired Pacific Telesis, and in 1999, they acquired Ameritech. And the big one is in 2005, they acquired AT&T. It cost them $16.5 billion, and the purchase came with the rights to their name. So soon after, they changed their name, SBC, to AT&T. Now, I know all of this is confusing. Let me try to summarize it. In 1984, SBC was born when that region of the telephone service was separated from the giant that was AT&T. Over the next 20 years or so, AT&T continued separating and splitting into different parts, and some of those parts were being sold to different companies, and they were just breaking up and getting smaller. Meanwhile, SBC, independent of any of that, had been growing mostly through the acquisition of those other regional companies. So in 2005, they were now large enough, and AT&T was now small enough for this deal to happen. So AT&T today is not directly the same company they were when they started in the 1800s, but they sort of are, in a way. I also want to take a minute to focus on Singular, because they're deeply involved in all of this confusion too. Singular Wireless was created in 2001 by 2 of these regional operating companies, Bell South and SBC. 60% owned by SBC and 40% owned by Bell South. So when Singular Wireless bought AT&T Wireless in 2004, like I mentioned, it meant that these 2 were splitting the ownership of it. SBC owned 60% and Bell South owned 40%. Well, in 2006, SBC went ahead and acquired Bell South as well, which meant they now owned all of Singular. And since they already owned the rights to the AT&T name from that AT&T acquisition a year earlier, it now meant that they had bought enough stuff to legally change the name of Singular Wireless to AT&T Wireless. That's why in 2007, all of you Singular customers suddenly became AT&T customers. That is a weird situation, isn't it? Singular bought AT&T Wireless, and then a few years later, sort of, AT&T Wireless but singular. I don't know, you may have to play that back to fully comprehend it, but that's what happened. And they didn't stop there. This new AT&T company has continued building over the past decade. In 2011, they tried to acquire T-Mobile. The two parties had come to terms and agreed to it, but then the Department of Justice and Sprint, they fought it, and it just never happened. But what did happen was in 2015, AT&T bought DirecTV for almost $50 billion, and in 2016, but not closed until June of 2018, Time Warner. That one cost over $85 billion and was met with incredible challenge, again by the Department of Justice and Donald Trump. The acquisition is such a big deal because it includes Warner Brothers and HBO and a ton of other stuff. My point is, if you're making $85 billion purchases, I'd say that you've risen again. Let me know in the comments, were you able to follow all this? Because I did my best, but it's a confusing situation. Aside from that, what an incredible story. It's like Inception, or many Christopher Nolan movies, where it could get a little hard to follow, but once you figure it all out, it's pretty neat. AT&T dominated that industry from the very beginning, and for one reason or another, were able to keep that dominance for almost a century. When they were finally broken down and separated, they fell on some tough times. They lacked direction and didn't know where they were headed, but then they were bought by a company that was stemmed from them and effectively became a new AT&T that has since gone on to become the 9th largest company in the United States. Now, did I cover everything that happened? Absolutely not. There's no way. This was a brief overview of the past century, hitting on most of the major events that were applicable to the story. So tell me if there's any part of this you'd like me to talk about in more detail, maybe the current makeup of the company. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Let me tell you more about today's sponsor, Audible, because boy have I been listening to audiobooks. I just finished this one, Dave Ramsey's The Total Money Makeover. I could not recommend it more. It's changed the way that I think about money, and I've since been applying his teachings to my own life. I truly believe that anyone watching this would benefit from listening to this audiobook. And the great news is, through the link in the description, you can get this for free. Audible is great. I just pop in those earbuds and go for a little walk. I'm learning, I'm entertained, I'm getting exercise. What more do you want? Each month, Audible members get a credit, good for any audiobook regardless of price. The credit rolls over if you don't use it, you can exchange your audiobook, and by the way, it's the largest selection of audiobooks on the planet. To get started, go to audible.com/companyman or text companyman to 500-500. Remember, if you're an Amazon Prime member, until the end of July, you can save 66% on your first 3 months. It's like 3 months for the price of one. The link is in the description, and thank you for watching.